Hey, welcome to our Winter 2025 Churchwide Study. My name is Kevin. I'm one of the pastors at Westover Church, and we're really excited that you're joining us. If it's your first time stepping into one of our groups, welcome. We're so glad that you've decided to come. Or if this is not your first time, maybe you've done some of our church-wide studies before, or maybe you've been part of a group for a while now, we welcome you as well. As we think about a church-wide study, there are some differences in what we do in this format. What we have is in the next 6 weeks, we're going to combine small group study with a large group worship experience. And this one is a little more special in my heart. And this is the reason why. When we think about who we are as Westover, we want to make maturing disciples of Christ. Now, how do we do that? Our vision is that we're going to be a church that gathers together to be equipped, but we're also scattered. Not only scattered to our neighborhoods, but where we live, learn, work, and play. And not only there, we don't stop there, but also to the nations. Now, as we're doing this, we want to be a people that walk after Jesus. We want to be disciples. So the question comes, what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? How do you follow Jesus? In the next 6 weeks, we're going to unpack that. We're going to unpack what does it look like for disciples to follow Jesus, but what does it look like for someone who comes to Westover to follow Jesus? Week 1, as we start out, we want to ask a simple question. What is Jesus inviting you into? You see, we're invited into all kinds of things. I look back on my life and I think about what people invited me into. Now, many of you may be my age, right around your 40s or your 50s. And when I was growing up, I could remember as a teenager that I would come home 3 o'clock every day, and the folks from Bayside School would invite me into something. Now, some of you are like, what in the world was that? There was a phenomenal TV show, according to me, called Saved by the Bell. And I could remember coming home and they would invite me into Bayside High. They invited me into something to experience what it would be like to actually go to high school in California and be the coolest kids ever. I can also remember in the middle of that, there would be these info commercials. And there was this guy named Billy Mays that would invite me into using OxyClean or something else that would get anything clean. And he would invite me to try this product and invite me in to this wonderful experience of no matter whatever it was, OxyClean could get it clean. In the 80s, I was invited to all kinds of movies by action stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, that you could get lost into this invitation into a life that was action-packed. Today, the generations are being invited into a lot of things by influencers and by social media. They're inviting you to follow them, to go down this pathway. So the question comes, what is in Jesus inviting you into? You see, Jesus has an invitation that we're going to see in Matthew 16:24 that lays out what we'll call a discipleship pathway. A discipleship pathway is just steps to following after this man, Jesus. And this is what he said to his disciples in Matthew 16:24. If any man would come after me, let him take up his cross, deny himself, and follow after me. So what is Jesus inviting you into? Well, the invitation is for you. And not only you, it's for everyone who would call upon the name of the Lord. When we look at lesson 1, we're going to look at John 8:1 through 11. And I'm going to read the passage to us as we think about what does it mean to come to Jesus. And in John 8:1 through 11, the Pharisees and the religious leaders have already been plotting to how they can stop Jesus. And Jesus comes to this place after he went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" They said this to test him, that they may have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. In verse 9, but when they heard it, they went away one by one. Beginning with the older ones, Jesus was left alone with a woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." We're going to look at three things, and in this small group time, we're going to have some questions to help bring and help a dialogue through this passage. Here's the first one in verses 1 through 5. Do we really want to hear what Jesus says? It's a really interesting question because a lot of people want to study about Jesus and many people follow him, but we really want to take to heart what he says. We're going to see here that there were those that wanted to learn from Jesus as he's teaching at the Mount of Olives and he comes into the temple, but there were those who did not want to learn from Jesus. They wanted to use Jesus. They wanted to use his words against him, and they wanted to use him to condemn this woman whom in most scholars believe was set up at this time. And so how do you see Jesus? Do you want to follow him or do you want to use him? Are you someone that sees Jesus as someone that can get you ahead in life, or do you see him as the master and king and the creator of all things, which Colossians says that he holds all things together, and you want to pattern your life and your habits and your lifestyle after him? You see, what you believe about Jesus will really change your life. This is what Danny Aiken says about following Jesus. He says, what we believe about Jesus, who he is, and what he did will shape greatly the rest of their life. So what do you want to learn about Jesus? What do you want to follow him into? You see, the theological teachers at this time, they wanted to catch Jesus in some kind of theological trap. Why? Because he threatened their lifestyle. He threatened their way of life. He threatened the power that they had, and he threatened their authority. Jesus isn't here to threaten you. He's not here to threaten you in any way. Sometimes when we view following Jesus as a threatening persona, that leads to sometimes a life to where we have submitted our hands to God, but not our heart nor our mind. And sometimes we can live basic moral lives instead of holy lives. Jesus is not here to threaten you. Jesus is here to free you. Do we really want to hear what he says? Or do we try to shape Jesus to be the kind of person, God, we want to follow? But secondly, I want you to see this in verses 6 through 9. Ultimately, when you come to Jesus, he's the one who knows the true punishment of sin. You're going to see that they bring a woman into his midst. And this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. Probably not very far from where the scene was, probably not very far from where the temple was. Now, of course, in the Mosaic law, you would stone such a woman, but you would actually stone both of those who committed adultery. But you'll notice that the man is nowhere to be found. The woman is brought there. And they wanted Jesus to condemn this woman. That's their request. What do you say that we do? They didn't stone her and actually take out the Mosaic law on themselves. They brought her to him as a teacher and said, what would you have us to do? You see, we believe that often one sin is worse than another, and indeed that is true in the consequences that we have. She was caught in the act, and the Old Testament said that she should die. You'll notice that he gives them the first opportunity to walk this law out. The one who cast the first stone should be without sin. And you notice from the passage that the oldest one, who probably had lived life, or we know had lived life longer than anyone, to the youngest, they walked away. Why? Because Jesus knows the true punishment for sin. And we'll get into that a little bit later, what that punishment is. So ultimately, Jesus is the one who knows the true punishment of sin, but ultimately also, Jesus does not only not condemn, but he frees us from the sin that condemned us in the first place. This is verses 10 and 11. They leave. He writes in the sand. Many people, scholars, don't know what he wrote in the sand. He stands up and he begins to write in the sand again. And after everyone leaves, he's left alone with this woman who's caught in adultery. You'll see that in the passage it says this. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Guilt is a horrible motivator. And when we think about guilt motivating us to quit sinning no more, it's absolutely a horrible motivator. But I will tell you, the grace of Jesus is far greater in our life. This woman at this point, Jesus doesn't condemn her. He condemns the sin and tells her, "Go and sin no more." But he frees her. So today, as we begin this 6-part study, what's keeping you from presenting yourself to Jesus? Is it the guilt, the sin, the people that may condemn you? What posture keeps you in front of Jesus with sin and shame and guilt? Romans 12, 1 through 2 says, "I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. This is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what the will of God is, what is good, acceptable, and perfect." Come to Jesus. He has condemned the sin and taken on the punishment for your sin by the cross that he gave himself on, and through the tomb that is now empty because of his triumph. So come to Christ today. There's some study questions that you and your group can work through, and I pray you have a great time studying the Word of God together.